blink, blink. And that's all it does. If I vaguely remember that there were like maybe some stores or something of that sort. And then you drive through the intersection, and within seconds, you're out of Earth. That's it. This is, we ought to make a field trip to Earth just to get your perception of it. So if you're ever driving, going out of Clovis, going east, you will see the sign eventually for Earth and point north. And if you care to take the trip, go ahead and do it.
Is that this city when you're going out of Clovis in Texas that like the roads are kind of like brake roads?
No, when you're coming out of Clovis, you don't hit Earth coming out of Clovis. You have to go north.
All right, never mind.
Okay, it's the other smaller cities like, not Shamrock, but this.
I just vaguely remember there was a weird city that was kind of like what you're describing was like the blinking light that I was driving through, and had like some weird like brick roads.
Okay, that's probably one of the small cities right after you leave Clovis. I've been there. Okay, enough of that. So let's go on to attitudes. And this particular section always prompts in me the same reaction. I hear the phrase, commonly spoken, you've got an attitude. And as a social psychologist, when I hear it, I have to laugh and say, yeah, of course. We all have attitudes, and we have multiple attitudes. But obviously, the common phrase, you've got an attitude, is trying to say something else. And if I interpret it correctly, in common slang, it's saying something to the effect that we would say, as young people on the East Coast, you're wearing, what do we call it? Something on your shoulder, like a board or something, and you want to pick a fight. You've got an attitude. Well, this is much more formally defined, and we're going to see some visual images of this after a bit from the film, Joe versus the Volcano. And I'll comment on the film a little bit later, but let me introduce you to the way we think of attitudes. And in the definition that's on screen, it's a learned predisposition, and I'm reading it deliberately, to respond in a consistently favorable or unfavorable manner with respect to a given object. Now dissect it. At the tail end of the definition is the word object, and you can hear the fighter jets. They're flying north. That's why we're getting, that's disturbing. I can't block that out. I lived on Air Force bases, and I still can't block out the noise. They don't put mufflers on those. They just straight exhaust. All right, you've got the object, and the object can be any of the items listed in the next bullet. All sorts of things. And in fact, when I put the name Earth, Texas on it, did you immediately form any type of attitude about Earth, Texas? Yes?
And it's sort of like one of the hippie communes, you know?
A what?
Like a hippie commune.
Hippie. Ooh, don't tell them that.
Earth.
Oh, Earth. Oh, Earth people and...
Well, you know, or like some of the self-sustaining communes, certain religious communes, stuff like that, have very like earthy names.
Fascinating. Because I have gone through Earth, Texas, I would never associate it the way you just did. And the people there would possibly be offended at that suggested association.
Sorry.
Oh, they don't know about it. We're not sending the video to them, even though they have internet access now. Okay. Sorry, these pages are sticking together. Oh, let me comment, I got distracted. Attitudes can have both favorable and unfavorable parts to them. So you can have a positive and favorable attitude about a certain object and an unfavorable attitude about another object. In the formation of attitudes, it's affected by the person's beliefs about the object and the amount of information the person has. And that's exactly what happened to you with your response about Earth, because you associated it with something else with no direct knowledge about Earth, Texas as a place. And that's what we do. We form these things in sort of a vacuum and don't necessarily come out with anything accurate. If you perceive positive attributes in the object, you develop a positive attitude, and obviously the opposite is true for negative. And then, in attitude change, we are constantly hit with what is called persuasive communication, things such as advertising and so on, that's intended to change our beliefs about buying a certain item or shopping in a certain store, and that's trying to pull us from one orientation to another. And the norms of any group to which you belong can affect the attitudes that you form about certain objects, and then when you become uncomfortable with some aspects of your beliefs, you experience what is called cognitive dissonance, and you may switch the attitude as a result. Now, there are three parts to an attitude, and we're going to test this with what observations you can bring to the film scene from Joe versus the Volcano. First is cognitive, which are perceptions and beliefs. You will, in the sequence that I'm going to show you, which runs, the first part of it runs about 4 minutes, and now I'm going to take it into the second part deliberately. I want you to note your perception of what you see. Then you develop feelings about the attitude object, and we give it the fancy psychological term affective. And then finally, you develop behavioral intentions about wanting to behave toward the object in a way that's consistent with your attitude. So let me try this. I talked to the dean just before coming to class, and I asked her for a small budget for travel money because I said I want to propose to my class at 12:30 that they could take some trips at the expense of the school. And she has given me verbal authorization for budget that will allow me to send one of you to Earth, Texas. So what is your attitude about Earth, Texas? And a trip to Earth, Texas, all expenses paid. Nobody wants to do that? Who said sure? Right there? Why?
Just an experience.
Thank you. And she is from Turkey. Remember? Am I correct?
Right.
And based on the pictures and images I've seen of Istanbul, Turkey, and my personal experience at 2 a.m. in Earth, Texas, there's one big difference. Okay. Let's change the object, and let's see. I'll have to talk to the dean again about this one to see whether she's willing to come up with a budget. But I think we could fund for 2 people to go to Singapore. How does that feel? Sound good? I've never gone to Singapore, by the way. It's on my short list. Why? You didn't want to go to Earth, Texas, but you want to go to Singapore? I'm looking at Los Alamos to see if we have any takers. Oh! Why? What do you know about Singapore? Pardon? It's a city? It's not a big, it's a city-state. The whole thing is one item. I don't know the square miles or square feet. Anybody who does can chime in, or you can Google it and find out on her computer. But why do you want to go to Singapore? Does it sound exotic? What is one thing you must never do when walking the streets of Singapore? Let's see if you know this.
Spit your gum on the ground.
Spit, period. Preferably do not chew gum, but if you spit, you can be fined if not arrested. Does that strike you as strange?
You can be fined here in Albuquerque for spitting on the sidewalk.
You can?
Yeah. It's a law.
I didn't know that. So we're becoming like Singapore. Wow. All right. I'm just having some fun with you because I want you to see how your attitudes operate and so on. So let's go to the film scene, which is the film Joe versus the Volcano on page 72 of your film book. And this show says 4 minutes. There's actually 2 parts to it, but I think I'll restrict it, and we're going to use it again later in the semester. But the quotation here in the film description, it says, quote, "Once upon a time there was a guy named Joe who had a very lousy job." And that's actually going to show on the screen as part of the signage, page 72. And we will see Joe Banks, played by Tom Hanks, arriving at this workplace. And I already comment here, he's got a bad job and so on, but what I would like you to do is assess Joe Banks' work attitudes and his attitudes toward various objects that we will see. And I may therefore restart it because of what I just said to let it run a little bit into the next material. And there's a whole group of people here. It's not just Joe, but it's all the people arriving at the workplace. And you'll see what they manufacture. And you can ask yourself the question of whether you would like to work in this particular environment. So let's go ahead and try it out. Joe Banks, how do you feel about coming to work? Positive attitude or negative attitude?
Negative.
How do you feel about the work environment?
Looks very bleak.
Bleak? Did it look clean?
No.
No, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but just going from the film image itself, you do not yet see his coworkers because Joe has just punched in his time card and he's going to go forward and turn left to go into his work area. But based on, and incidentally, that opening scene where there's a whole group of them marching and there's a zigzag is taken from a famous 1920 silent film. And I was trying to recall the name of it and I just can't. But it's a piece of cinematic symbolism. But in this instance, does this look like a really cool, positive, upbeat place to work? No. Would any of you really like to work here? All right, so let's go to work vicariously. So I'm not going to force you to work here. Run it a little bit. As Joe goes in, you're going to hear somebody on the telephone, and it's Mr. Wartori, played by Dan Hedaya, who is talking to someone. On his left is a man who goes unidentified, and I think it's on his right or maybe on his left is Dee Dee, who is played by Meg Ryan. And that's the man on the telephone is his supervisor, and the 2 other people are his coworkers, with Dee Dee as the most direct coworker, one he interacts with quite regularly. So let's run it another 2 minutes and see if you can formulate an impression of the attitude that Joe Banks has. Los Alamos is laughing furiously. He's coming to work. Does he really look like he wants to be there? How about what is his attitude toward the work environment, which includes all aspects, the architecture, the coffee area, the lighting, positive or negative?
Negative.
It's got to be negative. And I've actually worked in a building that looks like that. It's cinder block. When I worked for General Dynamics in San Diego many years ago, our building, we worked in the basement of the building that was cinder block. And when we had earthquakes, you could watch the ceiling move.